The foundation of this paper is that psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychotherapy are very queer activities indeed. The idea that one human being should enter a relationship with another, sometimes even lying down in a prone position for 50 minutes at a time, where one pays, either directly or indirectly through taxes, to speak of his or her innermost thoughts, feelings, impulses, dreams, desires, and the other doesn't, is surely very queer indeed. Now, there's a sparse UK literature, I don't think there's any actually, on psychotherapy of gay men that explores the psychodynamics around countertransference issues. This paper will discuss some of the tensions and questions that can arise when patient and therapist both share the same sexual orientation and sometimes the same social spaces. It seems for non-analytic therapists the tensions are fewer, not zero, or are of less conscious importance. For psychoanalytic psychotherapists, however, it does seem as if there are a number of tensions that can be hard to voice, hard for me anyway, to voice in public discourse. The background frame to psychoanalytically informed work is an intentionally austere, asymmetrical clinical relationship, eschewing both physical contact and verbal reassurance, in which the patient freely associates and the therapist, by his or refusal to consciously disclose material about themselves, allows transferences, fantasies and projections to develop. This paper takes the view that the intended austerity of the frame is always under attack by the patient, and I argue by the therapist as well, and it exists as a necessary fictional ritual space to enable the work of therapy to take place. I realise I've got the graveyard shift at 2:15 after lunch, but I do want to stress that there is it's a necessary fictional ritual space to enable therapy to take place. Now, the epistemophilic instinct is always at work, attempting to search out the nature of the primal seed, in my view, in which the therapist is engaged, and in the countertransference, that which the patient is engaged. My sense is that clinical work between a patient who's gay and a therapist who's gay and properly trained and supervised is nothing special, but it can provide some interesting points for discussion. I hope, not too patronisingly, that heterosexual therapists have something to learn from us. I feel I'm repeating a lot of the stuff that's been said already in today's talk, so please forgive that. I just go on. The early narcissistic wounds experienced by children who will grow up to be gay lead, I think, to the development of mental mechanisms that enable them to more or less survive as adults. Colloquially, one of these has been named as Gaydar, and I've come to see this as a form of non-pathological projective identification which makes it possible to identify who else is gay, and perhaps equally importantly, to see who is gay-friendly, or is potentially or actually dangerously homonegative. In the clinical setting, I see the importance of all psychoanalytic psychotherapists, male and female, gay, bisexual, heterosexual, transgender, whatever, in understanding and being plastic enough to accept and contain and manage the sometimes very powerful projections put onto and especially into them, both mentally and bodily. In the transference, my understanding is that the therapist needs to be able, in the fantasy world of the patient, to be both male and female, as well as lesbian, gay, or heterosexual, for effective work to take place. I realise this is a counsel of perfection, and why the activity has been called an impossible or the impossible profession. There's a growing body of evidence, and people in this room have contributed to it, that shows just how far we have to go as a profession in developing personal understandings in these areas. Such is the nature of the threat posed by the difference of homosexuality. This challenge must simply be taken up with training therapists of therapists, in their theoretical instruction and in clinical supervisions if they are not only to be effective but also not to be dangerous to their gay patients. The title of my paper, talking about countertransference, is, I think, what I call an ouch area for gay therapists working with gay patients. Specifically, the seeming tension between the need for analytic neutrality on the part of the therapist and possible conflicts with the pressure for disclosure on the part of the therapist. My understanding is that the patient is doing no more than following the basic rule of free association, which started with Freud and is still relevant today. The patient is revealing their internal world to the therapist by what they say, do not say, by their dreams, and I believe, very importantly, by what they project into the mind of the therapist and the body of the therapist. Projective identification always needs two parties, prototypically a baby and a mother. And as Bion reminds us, in the analytic dyad, the process is repeated over and over and over again. I think he said 1,004 times. My sense is that from the first moment of the assessment, the gay patient is consciously and unconsciously scrutinising the therapist for signals of danger, acceptance and understanding. Growing up gay in a heteronormative culture is such that there are always powerful narcissistic wounds that can be reactivated in the threatening intimacy of the clinical encounter. It is not so much in what the therapist actually says about himself or herself that's important, as what the patient reads by years of practice of projective identificatory mechanisms onto and into the therapist. In my view, many heterosexually orientated male therapists have problems in being open to projections put into them by their gay patients. My thinking is that the phallus, the symbolic penis, of the male therapist gets in the way. The countertransference challenge of the gay male therapist is not so much to keep his metaphorical penis zipped up, but to withstand the subtle and not so subtle attempts by the patient to seduce him by turning a blind eye to the parts of the internal world he wants or needs to keep hidden, particularly because they are painful and shame-inducing. By seduce, I am not thinking particularly concretely here, although it happens, but more symbolically. In undertaking assessment of any patient, I try to have as few assumptions as possible, or to be aware of my pre-countertransference anyway. However, I am aware that sometimes on discovering that a patient is heterosexual, of experiencing a twinge of disappointment. I take this as evidence of some unresolved part of my internal world, which always has its gaydar turned on. Perhaps evidence also of a libido, even at my advanced age. More interestingly, though, for you, is the management of the positive countertransference when, and this is increasingly so, the patients are open and reasonably at ease about being gay, and the negative countertransference when they are self-hating. I have to say, I spent a long time working in NHS settings where I've met many self-hating homosexuals who would not want to be called gay, so I speak from that kind of background. The clinical challenge is to monitor and continually rebalance the countertransference so that the patients can be shown you do know enough about what they're talking about, yet not to be blind to the envy, hate, sadism, aggression, as well as the love and gratitude which exists in us all. I simply cannot believe that in such a homonegative culture as this, and I'm not talking about central London now, as this, there are many gay men for whom their sexuality and sexual orientation is not in some way or other problematic. Psychoanalytic psychotherapy is better equipped to help if it at least attempts to stay in the zone between neutrality and affirmation, always losing, always trying to get back. It is in monitoring the countertransference that much of the work is to be done to keep under surveillance the task of checking out the attacks on the therapy frame by both the patient and the therapist. I'm trying to show how the early narcissistic wounds suffered by children who will be gay can leave their scars or propensities to find solidarity or safety when meeting the other. Is this person one of us? Can I trust them? Are they a danger? Of course, knowing that the other is gay really tells us very little about them. But my point is that it is the need for safety and solidarity that is important to understand. When I was first asked to speak at this conference, Dominic was keen that I talked about sex, rather than get caught up in dense theoretical discussions. Well, clearly I've failed on this already. After all, what defines gay men is sex, isn't it? As I've thought about this more, I'm not sure that encountering a patient from the bar at Covent Garden, at the Opera House here, one of the Opera Houses here, should provide any more of a challenge to a well-trained analytic psychotherapist than meeting a patient in a gay bar, sauna, or in a Gaydar chat room. That's the theory. What I've noticed in working with many gay men in therapy, there's a directness that they're able to speak about matters to do with sex is markedly more than with most heterosexuals. Perhaps somewhat paradoxically, I think my work with gay men has also empowered me to better help and understand heterosexual patients, both male and female. Psychoanalysis from its inception has always been full of boundary violations. I mentioned three. First of all, those two historical, one contemporary, kind of contemporary. Freud's analysis of Anna, his daughter. Melanie Klein's analysis of her children, and then writing it up, but not saying that the children were her children. And recently, the complex and seemingly abusive relationship reported in the London Review of Books between Masood Khan and Wynne Godley, which threw the British Psychoanalytic Society into such a tizzy. No, my approach to the problem is at a different level than the concrete question of what you do if you meet your patient in a back room or the opera or cruising or whatever. In my model of the psychoanalytic encounter, the patient has or will want to have sex with the therapist in fantasy, as this is a repetition of early primal and Oedipal scenes. I've got two little vignettes. After about a year, a male heterosexual patient in his 20s who was in therapy seemed to have stopped working analytically. In the countertransference, I become increasingly uneasy and sleepy. It's kind of 20 past 2 situation. Sessions pass, I can't get to the impasse between us, what's going on. My growing sense was that he had either consciously realised or been told that I was gay, and given his general heteronormative internal world, that was proving a bit, and perhaps more than a bit, of a problem for him. I felt in the countertransference quite awkward and not quite knowing how to proceed. And I tried to move towards saying something, but he, as if sensing that I was going to say something, cuts me off and said, he was very angry, and he said, "You're a fucking left footer." Now, for those who are not used to anti-Catholic abuse rhetoric, that means, translated subtitles, he is a Roman Catholic. If you think being gay is difficult, I can tell you. So this rather knocked me off my smug and defensive pre-perch. I've been ready to kind of, and I tried to understand the hostility in the transference. Anyway, he said, "I looked you up on Google." This is the epistemophic instinct mechanised. But actually what it did was led to a whole lot of material that I just did not expect. He'd been very badly treated by his Catholic mother, and he believed that she hated him after she became pregnant with him before she was married. And it's all the shit pours out about why didn't she have an abortion? She should have had an abortion, but he was trapped in that kind of space, and we're doing right. And between hatred and gratitude that he hadn't been aborted, but sometimes wishing he had. Sometimes I think we make assumptions about our patients which tell us more about ourselves than they do about the patients. I now assume, of course, that all my patients have checked me out on Google. Have you checked yourself out on Google? It's very revealing. And those of you who write erotic stories and put them on nifty.org, don't put your name on. The second vignette. Sorry, that is an in-joke for the homosexuals here who don't go to bars but stay at home with their computer all the time. It might look as exciting, but it's damn sight more reliable, the outcome of it. Second vignette. A 30-year-old mixed-race gay man with a history of sexual abuse. He'd been fucked by his father and by his father's male relatives. Had chronic symptoms of chronic depressive symptoms, and he was in weekly psychotherapy in an NHS psychotherapy clinic. After the second year of sessions, he argued for more intensive treatment and attended twice weekly. The patient never missed sessions and worked hard. Once he started twice weekly therapy, he started using the couch, and in some ways was a natural for psychoanalytic psychotherapy. He had a dream. In the dream, a white male friend of the patient was telling how a friend of a friend, a man of Indian descent background, was always complaining about racist attitudes in the UK. Not a difficult thing to imagine. The dream then switched to the white friend being sucked off for money by the man of Indian background. I asked him what he made of the dream. The patient replied that he thought the white friend in the dream represented a part of himself, and that the sucking off was not face fucking, he said, but more like a baby being suckled by his mother. Clearly it's a Kleinian patient. Melanie, not Calvin. That was a cheap joke. He said, have you noticed, Bernard, he said, it's my white part, the part that you never see. You're always going about my black part. I try not to go in part-object talk all the time, but I know what he was getting at. You see me as black, but I'm also white. I asked him about the sucking off seemingly being paid for by the person doing the sucking. The patient said, well, he said, it wasn't a violent dream, it was quite pleasant actually. I asked if there was anything else. He paused, long pause. You know, when your bowels begin to give way, you know something's going to be spilled. And he said, are you on Gaydar? I think I've seen him cruising one of the chat rooms. I was thrown. I couldn't think straight. And I asked the patient.
Well, are you on Gaydar?
I asked the patient, you do it to me, no, aren't you? Were you looking for me? It was a rather defensive response. This is serious. It is actually. It's very painful. I can tell you we're laughing about it, but it was no fun at the time. The patient said, I felt very uncomfortable and thought you might be in a chat room. I said to him, why? I'm not sure what book that was from. The patient said he felt very unsafe because it upset his view that he'd come to hold that whilst we could talk about sex in the therapy room, which he acknowledged he frequently and graphically did, he did so on the assumption that it was just talk. Later on, the patient went on to talk about his wish to have sex with me, but in a theoretical way, as he put it. If I'm honest, I was secretly hoping that you were in that room looking for me, he said. I suggested that what made the therapy possible was the knowledge that the therapy was talk, not just talk, and not action. The patient dismissively said, yes, you've said that before. I said, could we go back to the dream? Okay, if you want. The patient then said wearily, but he was also perhaps relieved in his tone. He said he thought the dream was something to do with himself and me. I think I come here and suck you off in a manner of speaking, he said, and I feel better for it. It's like nice and comforting. I said perhaps it paralleled in some way the relationship the patient had as a baby with his mother. Maybe. There was some nourishment, but it soon came to an end, and your mother lost interest in you. Like, I send you away after each feed. And he said, and replace me with more fucking babies. I said, yes. And he said, the bastards. And so the session continued. I think I'm giving you a flavour of the talk. Turning to the counter-transference, I think the vignette illustrates some of the creative possibilities of what I call a pick and mix Kleinian approach, really. I take the bits I like from Klein and dump the other bits, really, as we all do in any kind of religion. And it's true, Andrew. I'm a re-reformed Jew, really. Like Jesus, you know. No, of course I kept making a mess of it. Of course I misunderstood and responded to the patient's material in clumsy ways. Of course I was turned on at the thought of this physically very beautiful young man wanting to suck me off twice a week on the NHS. What I think is important to emphasise is that the patient did not actually suck me off, nor I him, but that we were able to forge a language from our shared experience as gay men that made sense to him and to me. Furthermore, the patient had the capacity, essential capacity for symbolic as-if thinking, notwithstanding the experience of childhood sexual abuse and the attendant risk of dissociation. It would only have been too easy for the metaphor to cease and become actual and physical. The structure provided by the framework and its austerity, I think, for the thinking function to keep operating and being recovered when it got lost, as it did, was there. I was able to stay in touch with the part in me that would only too readily have had sex with him, but not act on it. Freud, in Analysis Terminable and Interminable, says, we must not forget that the analytic relationship is based on the love of truth, and that it precludes any kind of sham or deceit. And when your dick gets hard, that's a kind of truth to that, which is not talked about very much, I've noticed in meetings. I would like to think that any reasonably well-trained psychotherapist, would have the skill, capacity and imagination to undertake this work. I believe that it is possible that we have some way to go in helping our heterosexual peers and ourselves to develop this. I also think that gay therapists have to consider their own individual capacities and incapacities in working with heterosexual patients. However, following Freud, as I do, the challenge is to be able to read our own counter-transference reactions to our patients, and when it comes to gay patients, we are often in the realm of the sexually explicit, not much experienced in work with heterosexual patients, in my view. The challenge is to understand that we will be seduced and want to seduce our patients, and to be able to read and continually rebalance our counter-transference reactions. As Freud said, it precludes any kind of sham or deceit. Thank you.
Gaydar. I'm a therapist. I'm not on Gaydar. I do worry about whether I would make use of Gaydar, whether I would want to sort of inhibit what I say or do on it if I was on it. So I really don't know who's in the same ether with me. And I wonder how Gaydar has actually affected the whole thing of therapist anonymity, neutrality, whatever, the whole shebang really. Is Gaydar really going to change our ideas of transference and counter-transference and whatever's left of the blank screen?
Well, in principle, I can't see any difference between being on Gaydar and being in the Crush Bar at Covent Garden Opera House, really. I don't know. I can't. I'm trying to think of it.
Well, you can't. People might see you without you knowing that they've seen you, which is one of the differences that I think I can identify.
Well, I have to say, I was on Gaydar one day at Leicester branch, whatever it's called, and I saw one of my patients, and that was it. Really, kind of, I wished I hadn't seen it because of the the contrast between what I saw in the Gaydar picture and what I was being presented with. I felt I breached something, and I could never look at him again when I saw him and think, I've seen a different side to you. I feel I've seen a lot more of you as well, because it was so explicit. And I don't know. I'm not being very articulate because I feel that it's kind of new territory to be in.
I think it is new territory. I'm also wondering if there are people here who don't understand what we're talking about. Because there's a number of gay men here who probably do understand what gaydar is, but there's a number of people here who perhaps don't know what we're saying. And just in case that's the case, Gaydar is an internet website that has profiles where people can put a profile up to look for a partner, either a sexual partner or a relationship partner, that includes photos and descriptions about yourself. And then there are chat rooms where you can go in and be in there. And you can be anonymous, you can hide, you don't have to have your face on there. Or you may be very visible, and people use it differently in that sense. But that's kind of the terrain that we're discussing.
Gaydar in the title of the paper is in italics, that kind of gaydar, as opposed to not in italics, which is the kind of pathological, non-pathological predictive identification mechanism. That's good though.
First of all, I really want to thank you for what I think is really a very vulnerable and courageous use of self-disclosure professionally, which I all too rarely find in professional meetings, and I think is really, really useful. So I really want to applaud you for that, because I think it's great. And in terms of the question raised about gaydar, I don't know that it's any different than being seen by a patient in a back room or on a disco floor, or I have a colleague who is a therapist in the New York gay community who chose to do a sex act at a major public party, but he discussed it with his supervisor. The supervisor said, as long as you're willing to deal with it in therapy, knowing that patients are going to see you, then you deal with it. And I know that the last time I was actually in a sex party in New York, what happened to me was I had just unzipped and started, and I looked over, the patient was unzipping and watching me. So of course I lost my erection, zipped up, and I went home and discussed it with him in session the next week. And well, how'd you feel about seeing me there? It brought up wonderful material because he assumed I was in a relationship and I was cheating on my partner, and none of which.
So the blank screen was maintained. Slightly cooler around the edge.
But the practicing therapy was a relatively small community, made smaller by the internet. I think is going to be a cutting edge of clinical challenge.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to link what you were saying to what Mary Lynn was saying about the need for a phenomenological approach, which would involve detailed description and paying attention to the phenomena, because within the category erection or within the category lubrication, there are so many different subcategories, and it's difficult to find, never mind places where you can talk about different kinds of excitement. There aren't even books about it, really. Broadly speaking, in the heterosexual world, there's a distinction made between lust and sex within a relationship, and that's about as far as the particularity goes. And I think that what I liked about your paper was you were beginning to shove us in the direction of this sort of more phenomenological approach to sexual arousal. And that, of course, if you deconstruct it, would also mean applying the same kind of phenomenological approach to lack of sexual arousal, so that there are numerous potentially describable states of non-erection or dryness. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Well, Freud said the ego is a bodily ego, and I know when I've got a damp end of dick at the end of a session, something's been going on that it needs attending to.
And I think, just to push it into my sorts of areas, I think that family process also involves some kind of understanding of different kinds of excitation, real excitation, not just hypothetical excitation, that takes place in completely normal, appropriate parental interaction with children. So I think there's an across-the-board missing bit here. Now, some people would want to go tantric on this, or Kundalini-esque on this. Now, I don't do that because I'm a Westerner. On the other hand, the fact that these models exist does offer some hope that we might be able to create our own.
just want to thank you for really a lovely clinical presentation, and you're very funny too.
Yeah.
They come from Lancashire. 10 a penny every street to go along. Watch Coronation Street. Sorry, that's his fault.
It's okay, you're my first. So. But I think the subject came up yesterday about somebody saying they want to communicate to their patients that they can handle everything that the patient brings up. And I guess I said I don't want to communicate that to patients because I really can handle everything that will come up in my practice. So my sense is that the question of what to do about places like Gaydar.com, about sharing public spaces with patients, you should only do that if you're prepared to deal with the consequences of sharing public spaces with your patients, because that's a real possibility, that it's going to happen. And if you act in a dissociated way as if it were not, you're doing both your patients and yourselves a disservice. And if you decide that you are prepared, then you need to think about how you're going to talk about it and not just wait for it to happen.
Thank you. It's true.
We need to stop. I think we should just stop there because it's just about time to bring. It's just about time to bring up Chess. So thanks very much, Bernard.